There are places in the American West where the wind does not stop, where it comes down off the high ridges in October and does not let up until April, and the people who stay through it learn a particular kind of quiet. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of endurance. Willa Crane knew that quiet the way she knew the sound of her own breathing, intimately and without comfort. She had been a widow for 14 months when the drifter came through Grady's Bluff on a Thursday in late autumn. She had 2 children, $11 in a tin behind the flour sack, a homestead that the town had taken to calling hard luck land, and a harness so cracked it had split clean through the left cheek piece the morning before. She was standing in the yard when he came down the road. She was not a woman who asked strangers for help. She had not asked anyone for anything in 14 months. But she held up that harness and she said the only words she had left. "Can you mend this?" It was not quite a question the way she said it. It was the way a woman speaks when she has already considered every other option and found them wanting. And the man on the road, tall, spare, with a canvas bag over one shoulder and no particular hurry in his step, looked at the harness. Then he looked at her, and he said yes. What happened after that was not a dramatic thing. It did not announce itself. It came in the way that most true things come, slowly, in small pieces, through hard work and cold mornings and meals eaten in near silence, through children who needed, and a woman who refused to break, and a man who stayed for one reason and then another, and then, finally, for the only reason that matters. This is the story of Willa Crane and Samuel Cole, and it begins, as most honest stories do, with something broken and someone willing to try. The town of Grady's Bluff sat in a valley between 2 ridges that caught the wind from both directions. And in late autumn, it was the kind of place that made a person feel small without meaning to. The main street had a livery, a dry goods, a post office the size of a closet, and a saloon that did more business than all the others combined. There were perhaps 200 souls in the valley, counting the homesteads out along the creek road, and most of them had opinions about most things, and were not shy about sharing them. It was that kind of place, the kind where a woman's circumstances were considered general property. Willa Crane had lived on the edge of that town's opinion for 14 months. Her husband, Gerald, had died in the spring of the previous year, a fever that came on fast and did not give warning, and had left her with 2 children, a homestead 3 miles out on the creek road, and debts that were not large but were steady, the way a slow leak is steady, wearing at the same spot until the wood gives. She had not sold. That was the first thing the town noted about her. She had not sold, and she had not moved in with her sister in Telluride, which was what sensible widows did when the land was already half against them. She had stayed, and she had worked, and she had made it through one winter, which was more than most people had expected. The land itself was the second thing. Gerald's father had broken that ground 20 years before, and had never quite broken it properly, and the soil along the lower field had a clay hardness to it that resisted water and seed both. 2 summers in a row the yield had been poor enough that Gerald had borrowed against the following year, and then Gerald had died, and the following year had come around, and Willa had paid what she could and deferred what she could not. The homestead was still hers on paper, but paper had a way of changing in a valley where certain men had certain interests, and one of those men was named Garrett, and he had made 2 quiet visits to Willa's door in the past 6 months, and both times she had thanked him for stopping and told him the land was not for sale, and closed the door with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. She was 31 years old. She had brown hair that she kept pinned back without fuss, and hands that showed the work she did, and eyes that people in the town described as serious, which was their way of saying that she did not perform cheerfulness for their comfort. She cooked well and kept a clean house and did not ask for help and did not complain, and the town respected her in the specific and limited way that towns respect a woman who does not cause them inconvenience. Mrs. Aldrich, who kept the dry goods with her husband and knew the business of every family in the valley, had said more than once that it was a shame about Willa Crane. What a shame, as though Willa herself were a broken thing beyond repair. The children were Thomas, who was 7, and Ruth, who was 5. Thomas had his father's coloring and his mother's stubbornness, and he had taken on a seriousness in the past year that sat a little heavily on a boy his age, the way a coat cut for a grown man sits on a child's shoulders. He did what was asked of him without being asked twice. Ruth was softer, more given to watching than speaking, and she had a habit of carrying small objects from place to place: a smooth stone, a dried seed pod, a piece of blue ribbon, as though she were building an inventory of the world against some future need. They were good children. They were tired children. They did not complain either, which meant they had learned it from their mother. The harness had been cracking for 2 seasons. It was a driving harness, left cheek piece and crown piece both, and Gerald had repaired it twice with the wrong kind of oil, and it had never sat right after. On the Thursday morning that the drifter came down the creek road, the left cheek piece had split entirely. A clean break that made the harness unusable, and Willa had stood in the yard holding it and done the arithmetic that she was always doing. What it would cost to replace, what she had in the tin behind the flour sack, what could wait and what could not. The wagon needed the harness needed either mending or replacing. Replacing it meant the tin, and the tin was already low. She stood there in the yard with the broken leather in her hands, and the wind coming down off the north ridge, and Thomas watching her from the porch with that too-old expression on his face. And she was thinking hard about nothing good. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of boots on the dry road, unhurried, a particular cadence that was neither slow nor fast but simply steady. She looked up, and there was a man coming down the creek road from the direction of town, canvas bag over one shoulder, wearing a coat that had been good once and was still serviceable, with the kind of walk that belongs to a man who has covered a great deal of ground on foot and made his peace with it. He was perhaps 35, perhaps a little more. He did not look like trouble, and he did not look like much else either, which was a thing she noticed. He looked like a man who had no particular destination and no particular story he was trying to tell about himself. She was not a woman who asked strangers for assistance. She had not asked anyone for anything in 14 months, not out of pride exactly, but out of a clear understanding that every debt has a face on it, and she already owed more faces than she cared to count. But she looked down at the harness in her hands, and she looked up at the man on the road, and something in her, some practical, exhausted, undecorated part of her, made the decision before she had finished making it consciously. She held up the harness. She said the words, "Can you mend this?" The man stopped. He looked at the harness the way a man looks at something he is trying to place, not with urgency, but with a steady, taking stock attention. Then he looked at her. He had gray eyes and a face that did not give much away, and he was quiet for a moment in a way that was not rude, only considered. Then he said that he could. He said he would need a few things, a leather needle and some good wax thread and a piece of scrap hide if she had one, and that it would take the better part of an afternoon. He said all of this without putting any weight on it, without performing willingness or making a point of his own generosity. He said it the way a man says a thing that is simply true. Willa looked at him for a moment. Some things cannot be verified in advance. Some decisions are made on a quality of stillness in another person, a sense that they will not complicate what is already complicated. She told him there was scrap leather in the barn and she could find the rest. She told him his noon meal was included if the work was done by then. He nodded and came through the gate and set his bag down by the barn door and got to work. And Thomas watched from the porch the entire time without saying a word, and Ruth came and stood beside her mother and held the piece of blue ribbon in both hands. "His name," he told her when she brought out the thread and the needle, was Samuel Cole. He said it without elaboration. She said her name was Willa Crane and this was her land, and he said, "Yes, ma'am," and turned back to the harness, and that was all the introduction they gave each other. It was enough. It was in its way more honest than most introductions Willa had received in 14 months of people arriving at her door with sympathy in their mouths and arithmetic in their eyes. Samuel Cole had no arithmetic that she could see. He had a leather needle and a steady hand and a piece of broken harness in his lap, and he was fixing it. That was all. And it had been a long time since anything had been simply that. He finished the harness by noon, as he had said he would. The repair was clean and tight, the wax thread pulled even, the scrap hide cut and fitted with a precision that suggested a man who had done this kind of work before and had not needed to be taught twice. Willa examined it in the yard without comment, turned it over in her hands, ran her thumb along the stitching. It would hold. It would hold longer than the original, if she was honest about it. She brought it into the barn and hung it on its nail and went inside to put the meal on the table. And she did not say much about the quality of the work because she was a woman who believed that good work spoke for itself and did not require a ceremony. They ate at the table, the four of them, Willa, Thomas, Ruth, and Samuel Cole, who sat where she indicated and took what was offered and did not take more than his share. She had made salt pork and boiled potatoes, and the last of the summer corn she had put up in jars. And there was bread from that morning, and he ate with the focused quiet of a man who has not always had a table to sit at. Thomas watched him across the table with the particular scrutiny of a boy who is trying to determine something important and has not yet gathered enough evidence. Ruth ate her corn and watched too, but with less calculation and more simple curiosity, the way a child watches a new kind of bird at the fence post. Samuel Cole ate and did not perform anything for either of them. That, Willa thought, was either a very good sign or no sign at all. After the meal he thanked her, plain and direct, and picked up his canvas bag from beside the door. She told him there was a fence post down on the north side of the pasture that had been down since September, and that she had not had time to reset it, and that if he was not in a hurry she would include supper. She said it the same way she had held up the harness, not asking exactly, but stating a fact and leaving space for a response. He set the bag back down. He asked where she kept the post driver and the wire, and she told him, and he went out. And she stood at the window for a moment, watching him cross the yard with the long, unhurried stride of a man who is not wasting time but is also not racing it. Then she turned back to the dishes. He stayed that day, and the next, and then through the weekend. And by the following Thursday, he had been there a week. He slept in the barn on a bedroll he carried in his canvas bag, and he did not ask for anything beyond what was offered at meals. And in the mornings, he was up before Willa, which she discovered on the second day when she came out in the gray early light to find the water already drawn and the woodpile by the door restocked. She stood looking at the woodpile for a moment without moving. It was not a large thing, but it had not been there the night before, and now it was. And someone had risen in the cold dark to put it there without being asked and without apparent expectation of notice. Some things are too quiet to name and too large to ignore. The work he found was not in short supply. The pump housing had a crack that was letting cold air in and would let water out come a hard freeze, and he reseated it with a piece of tin and some caulking compound from the dry goods in town, paying for it himself without mentioning it, a fact Willa only discovered when she went to settle with Mr. Aldrich at the end of the month and was told the account had been cleared. She did not bring it up with Samuel directly. She made a better cut of meat for supper that Friday, and he ate it without comment, and that was the conversation they had about it. Two people can say a great deal without opening their mouths if they are paying attention. The town noticed, of course. Towns like Grady's Bluff are built on noticing. By the end of the first week, there was talk at the dry goods and the post office and along the porch of the saloon. The specific kind of talk that attaches itself to a widow and a strange man and will not let go without a reason. Mrs. Aldrich, whose opinions traveled faster than the Weekly Post, had already formed and expressed a view. It was not an unkind view exactly, but it was a view with conditions attached, the way most opinions in small towns have conditions attached. She said to Mrs. Pierce at the dry goods that it was unusual, a man like that staying on, and that she hoped Willa Crane was being careful, which was a way of saying several other things without saying them outright. Garrett heard about it too. He was a man of about 50, broad through the shoulders, with a way of dressing that was a degree too fine for the valley, and a way of speaking that was a degree too smooth. He had interests in 3 properties along the creek road, and wanted a 4th, and the 4th was Willa's. And he had been patient about it in the way that a man is patient when he believes the outcome is already settled and is merely waiting for events to confirm it. He heard about the drifter, and he did not move immediately. He was not a man who moved immediately. He filed the information away and waited, and watched, and kept his patience a little longer. Meanwhile, Thomas had begun following Samuel at a distance of approximately 10 feet. He did not announce this. He simply appeared wherever Samuel was working, the fence line, the barn, the pump housing, and stood at his self-assigned distance and watched with those serious eyes, and said nothing. Samuel did not make a fuss about it and did not send him away. Once, when he was resetting a loose board on the back of the barn, he handed Thomas the spare nails to hold without asking or explaining, and Thomas held them with both hands, and a concentration that suggested this was the most important task he had been assigned in some time. Ruth appeared less predictably but with equal regularity, usually with some small object in her hand that she would show to Samuel, and then take back without any particular expectation of response. He looked at each object with the same steady attention he gave to everything. That was enough for Ruth. Willa watched all of this from a careful distance of her own. She was not a woman who confused gratitude with feeling, or company with attachment. She had learned in the past 14 months to hold things lightly, to avoid leaning on what might not hold. But there was a specific quality to Samuel Cole's presence in her yard and at her table that she found herself thinking about in the hours after the children were in bed and the lamp was low. It was not his usefulness, though he was useful. It was something else. It was the way he moved through her homestead as though he were trying not to disturb anything that was already standing. The way he never looked at the land with the appraising eye of a man calculating its worth. He looked at what was broken, and then he fixed it. And then he looked for what else was broken, and that was all he seemed to want from the place. On the Thursday evening that marked his 2nd week, she set a piece of dried apple pie on the table after supper, which was not a usual thing. Thomas looked at it with open surprise. Ruth touched the edge of the plate with one finger to confirm it was real. Samuel looked at it the way a man looks at something he was not expecting and is trying to decide what to do with. Willa poured the coffee and sat down and said nothing about it, and after a moment he cut into his piece and ate it, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. And Thomas saw it and looked down at his own plate quickly, as though he had witnessed something private. Some moments are small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, and large enough to change the temperature of a room. The pass closed on a Tuesday in the first week of November, which was earlier than usual, and earlier than anyone had planned for. A man who had come through from the eastern side said the snow was already axle-deep at the high point and still falling, and that unless someone had urgent business on the other side, they would do well to stay where they were until March. Samuel Cole heard this at the livery, where he had gone to pick up a new file for the barn hinges, and he came back to the homestead and set the file on the workbench and stood for a moment looking at the north ridge where the clouds had come down low and gray and permanent-looking. He did not say anything about it at supper. He passed the bread and ate his beans, and listened to Thomas describe something that had happened at school with the particular intensity that 7-year-old boys bring to narration. And when supper was done, he went out to the barn and Willa washed the dishes and the lamp burned low, and the wind moved around the outside of the house the way it does when it has settled in for a long stay. She did not ask him whether he was planning to leave before the pass closed or planning to stay until it opened again. That would have required a kind of direct address that neither of them had established. And besides, the pass was already closed, and the question had answered itself in the way that some questions do, not by being resolved, but by being overtaken by circumstance. He was here. The winter was here. There was work enough to last until spring, and a barn that was warmer than the road, and a table that had a place at it. What more a man required beyond that, she did not know. She was not sure it was her place to ask. Garrett came on a Wednesday, 3 days after the pass closed. He came in the mid-morning when the children were at school, and Willa was alone in the yard, splitting kindling. And he came with the particular unhurried ease of a man who believes his arrival is welcome or is willing to pretend so. He had his good coat on and his hat in his hand, and he spoke to her with a kind of practiced warmth that was the verbal equivalent of the coat. It covered the shape of things, without being the thing itself. He said he had heard the pass was closed early, and that he hoped she was well situated for the winter. He said he knew things had been difficult, and that his offer for the land still stood, and that he was prepared to be generous given the circumstances. He said the word generous the way a man says a word he has rehearsed, which is to say, with a little too much weight on it. Willa set the hatchet on the block and looked at him. She said the land was not for sale. She said it the same way she had said it twice before, without heat and without apology, the way a woman states a fact she has already made her peace with. Garrett smiled in the way he smiled, which did not reach far enough up his face to be convincing, and he said he understood, and that she should not hesitate to call on him if her situation changed. He put his hat back on and he turned to go. And it was at that moment that Samuel came around the corner of the barn with an armload of cedar posts for the corral repair, moving with the particular steadiness of a man who is not hurrying and is not performing calm either. He simply was calm, the way certain animals are calm, not because nothing is happening, but because they have decided how they feel about what is happening. He looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at him. Samuel set the cedar post down against the barn wall without any change in his expression and went back around the corner for another load. Garrett watched him go. Then he looked at Willa, and something in his careful smile had shifted by a degree, the way a lamp shifts when the wick is trimmed, and he said good morning and walked back up the road, and that was the end of the visit. Willa stood in the yard after he had gone and did not move for a moment. Then she picked up the hatchet and went back to the kindling. Samuel came around the barn again with the second load of posts and set them with the first, and did not ask about the visitor and did not comment on what he had seen. He simply went back to work. There are men who would have asked. There are men who would have made a point of their own presence, made it a gift she was obliged to receive. Samuel Cole did neither. He went back to the cedar posts, and the wind came down off the north ridge, and the kindling got split, and the morning continued. The frost came hard that Friday night. Willa woke at 2 in the morning with the particular alertness that comes from a sound that should not be there, and she lay still and identified it as the wind finding a new gap somewhere in the north wall of the root cellar, which meant the temperature inside was dropping, which meant the winter stores were in danger. She was up and dressed and out the door with a lamp before she had finished the thought, and she found Samuel already in the cellar with his own lamp, pressing burlap against the gap and holding it with one shoulder, while he reached for the caulking tin on the shelf behind him. She held the burlap flat while he sealed it, and they worked in the close, cold dark of the cellar without speaking, handing each other what the other needed before it was asked for, which is a thing that happens between people who have been paying attention to each other, even when neither of them has said so. They worked through the better part of 2 hours, checking the bins and the crock jars, and packing straw around the root vegetables that had been left exposed. The cold was significant and the work was not light, and when they finally came back into the house in the gray early morning, Willa made coffee on the stove and they sat at the table across from each other, with their hands around their cups, and the lamp between them and the house beginning to warm again. It was the first time they had been alone together at that table, and it was quiet in a way that was not uncomfortable. Some silences are empty, and some silences are full, and this one was full, stacked with all the things that two people accumulate in 3 weeks of working and eating and watching and not saying. She refilled his cup without being asked. He said thank you. She said the stores should hold now if the cellar stayed sealed. He said he would check it again in the morning. Then he said, not looking at her but at the middle distance somewhere past the stove, that it was good land. He said it quietly, the way he said most things, without decoration. He said it had good water, and the lower field would yield better if it were broken differently in spring. She looked at him across the table. He looked back at her. He was not asking anything. He was not suggesting anything beyond what the words contained. But the words contained something. They both knew it. It was Thomas who said it, 2 days later, on a Sunday morning. Samuel was in the barn working on the corral hinge when Thomas came out with the water pail, and he handed it up without being asked, and Samuel took it and used it and handed it back. And Thomas stood there for a moment in that particular stillness of a child who has made a decision. And then he said it. He said it quietly, more to himself than to Samuel, or perhaps to the barn, to the cold air, to the fact of the morning. He said it, and Samuel went still for just a moment, his hand on the hinge, and then he continued working. He did not correct Thomas. He did not respond at all. He just kept working, and Thomas stood beside him and watched. And in the house by the kitchen window, Willa had heard it through the cold, clear air, and she stood with her hands in the dishwater and did not move for a long moment, and did not correct him either. The word Thomas had said was a short word. 4 letters. It was the only word in the language that weighs as much as a house. Garrett came back on a Thursday in the 2nd week of November, and this time he did not come alone. He brought with him a man named Purcell, who worked in some capacity for the land office in the county seat and who carried a leather satchel and a manner that was meant to suggest official weight. They came in the mid-afternoon when the light was already thinning toward the ridgeline and the temperature had dropped sharply since noon, and they knocked at the front door with the knock of men who do not expect to be kept waiting. Willa answered it with her hands still floury from the bread she was making, and she looked at the two of them on her porch and felt the specific cold that has nothing to do with weather. Garrett explained himself with the smooth patience of a man who has rehearsed both the words and the outcome. He said that it had come to his attention that certain payments on the land note had not been made in the agreed schedule, and that under the terms of the original instrument, there were provisions for remedy that the note holder was entitled to pursue. He said it carefully and without apparent pleasure, which was its own kind of unpleasantness. Purcell opened the satchel and produced a document and held it out to Willa, and she took it with her floury hands and looked at it, and the letters held still on the page, but the meaning of them moved around in a way she did not like. She had made the payments. She had made all of them that she could make, and the ones she had deferred with the knowledge of the man she had borrowed from, who was not Garrett. She said this plainly. Garrett said that the note had changed hands in September, which was information she had not been given, and that the new terms had been set by the new holder, which was himself. Samuel came up from the barn while Garrett was still speaking. He came up the yard path at the same unhurried pace he used for everything, and he stepped up onto the porch and stood to the side of the door, not between Willa and the two men, not positioned as a challenge, simply present, the way a post is present, or a wall. He looked at the document in Willa's hands and held out his own hand for it, and she gave it to him, and he read it with the same focused quiet he brought to repairing things. taking it apart piece by piece, seeing where it held and where it did not. Garrett watched him with the recalibrated expression of a man who has encountered an unscheduled variable. Purcell looked at his own boots. Samuel handed the document back to Willa and looked at Garrett and said that he would like to see the instrument of transfer by which Garrett had acquired the note, and the recorded date of that transfer, and the notification sent to the borrower as required by the original terms. He said it the way he said everything, quietly, without hurry, without heat. Not a challenge. A request for specific things that a man is entitled to request. Garrett said that was not his concern. Samuel said with respect it was if the transfer had not been properly recorded and the borrower not properly notified, in which case the remedy being sought was premature under the law of this territory. He said territory, the way a man says a word he is certain of. Garrett looked at him for a moment, the way a man looks at something he had not properly accounted for in his planning. And then he looked at Purcell, and Purcell looked at the satchel. There was a silence on the porch. The wind moved through the yard and shifted the bare branches of the cottonwood by the fence and kept going. Some silence in a negotiation are empty, and some are full, and this one was full of the specific weight of a plan meeting an obstacle it had not prepared for. Garrett put his hat back on, which he had been holding, and he said they would be in touch. And he and Purcell went down the porch steps and up the yard path and through the gate. And Willa watched them go from the doorway with the document in her floury hands. And Samuel stood beside her and watched too. And when they had gone far enough up the road, he went inside and came back with a piece of paper and an envelope from the cedar chest in the back room that Willa had not seen him touch before. And he told her he had made inquiry at the county clerk's office 3 weeks prior regarding the status of the note, and that he had in hand a copy of the transfer document, which had in fact not been filed in the manner required by territorial statute, and that he had written a letter to that effect which he intended to post when the road to town was passable tomorrow morning. Willa looked at him. She looked at the envelope in his hand, and at his face, and at the envelope again. She said, "When had he done that?" He said 3 weeks ago. On the Tuesday, he had gone into town for the caulking tin. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about that Tuesday, and about the caulking tin, and about all the days between that Tuesday and this Thursday, and about the fact that he had said nothing, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was no need to say it until there was. Some men do their talking before the work is done. Samuel Cole did his work, and then, if required, mentioned it. She took the envelope from him and held it with the document and stood in the doorway for a moment more. Then she went back inside to the bread, because the bread still needed finishing. And that was the kind of woman she was. The letter was posted the following morning, and within 2 weeks a response came from the county clerk's office confirming the deficiency in the transfer filing and the consequent invalidity of the remedy sought. A second letter, shorter and without warmth, came from Garrett, who said nothing directly but whose silence on the matter of further visits said everything necessary. He did not come back to Willa's door that winter, or in the spring, or after. The land remained hers. The note was restructured through the proper office on terms that were not comfortable but were manageable, which is what most honest lives are. Not comfortable but manageable and held together by the willingness to keep working. Mrs. Aldrich brought a pie in December, which was her way of adjusting her position without acknowledging that her position had required adjustment. It was a good pie, a dried cherry with a proper lattice top, and she set it on the table and said that it was a hard winter, and she hoped the family was keeping well. And she used that word, family, with only a brief hesitation, the way a person steps onto ice they are not sure of and finds it solid. Willa thanked her and cut 3 pieces and called the children in, and did not make anything more of it. Samuel was in the barn. He did not come in for pie. That was all right. Some adjustments are made in small rooms, and some in large ones, and not everyone needs to be present for every kind. The winter deepened, and the pass stayed closed, and the homestead kept its rhythm. Samuel repaired the south wall of the barn, and restrung the corral, and split enough wood to last past March, and did it all without announcement, the way a man does the work of a place he intends to maintain. Thomas helped where he could, and stopped keeping his 10-foot distance sometime in late November, without ceremony, the way children abandon their caution when they have gathered enough evidence. Ruth gave Samuel the piece of blue ribbon on a Tuesday morning in January, pressing it into his hand with both of hers, and then going back to her breakfast as though the matter were settled, which in her view it apparently was. He folded it carefully and put it in the breast pocket of his coat, and did not make a speech about it. And it was there still when the snow began to thin in late February, and the first gray-green showed at the edges of the lower field. He did not say he was staying. He did not make a declaration, or an announcement, or an offer of any kind that required an answer. He simply did not leave, and spring came on the way it always does in that valley, slowly, without fanfare, with a patience that outlasts the cold. And the lower field got broken differently that year, in the long furrows he had described at the kitchen table in November, and the water ran the way it was supposed to run, and the planting went in on time, and the 2 horses in the corral put their heads over the fence rail in the mornings, and waited for him the way animals wait for the person they have decided to trust, which is without urgency and without doubt. Willa watched all of it from the kitchen window, and from the yard, and from the porch in the evenings, and she did not name what she was watching, because some things are too large for naming, and some things do not need to be named to be real.